When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers.
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Race Haven radio show and podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race in America. My name is Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 6 of Race Haven, and the title of today's show is Systemic Racism and White Privilege, Solutions-Focused or Divisive Distractions. We are going to explore these topics deeper by dialoguing about the following questions. What is systemic racism and white privilege? Where did these terms come from and why are they needed? And are these terms just tools used to portray quote-unquote blacks as victims and quote-unquote whites as oppressors? We'll explore these questions and more. So, if you're one of our live listeners, you can call in and join the dialogue now to share your perspective on these topics by dialing 929-477-4107, then press 1, and I'll know that you want to speak. If you're listening at home online, be sure to visit and join our Race Haven Facebook group and share any thoughts, questions, or comments and dialogue with our online community. So what I'd like to do next is introduce our guest host for today. The first person I'd like to introduce to all of you is Mr. John Costino. He's an entrepreneur that I met 3 years ago. He and we met through the home-based business industry, and I'll let John tell you a little bit about his background before we get started. But before I do that, I want to first just say that I appreciate John so much because he listened to, I believe, maybe the first episode or saw that I started this project, and he reached out to me, and he expressed, how he felt a similar concern about bringing people together to have constructive dialogue so that we can eliminate some of the polarization and the sensationalization that we see or sensationalized media coverage in social media and the news media and show people and model for people how two friends from very different backgrounds can come together and share our worldview as different as they are and dialogue about it so that we can get to know each other better. Because at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. So I appreciate John, and I just wanted to say that he came on last week. This is his second time coming on with us. So John, please introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself very briefly.
Absolutely, Scott, and thanks again so much for having me on. It really is my pleasure to be here, and I think you hit it right on the head. One of the challenges that I think we all have is the media does such a poor job of really kind of portraying what happens in the real world. And again, you and I met through network marketing, through home-based business, became great friends, have, many things in common, and obviously many things where we come from different backgrounds, as you said. But basically at the core, we're the same. We have the same philosophies, and that's more than anything else why I wanted to offer, anything I could bring to this. Because of my almost 30 years now as a sales trainer, that's my background, and I guess that's probably what you wanted me to answer was I've traveled for the last 26, 27 years, trained over 1 million people from every, area of this country, different races, different genders, different religions, different age groups, and I feel that everybody at their core is the same, and we kind of get manipulated by the media and in our cultural differences. So I'm excited to be here and see if I can throw my hat into the ring and see if we can all find solutions together.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being here. The next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole. I met Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole, and she's given me permission to call her Nicki from here on out, so I'll go with Nicki. So I met Nicki because I actually read an article of hers about systemic racism. You see, I'm someone that, when I read about different things going on in the media, and I think a lot of people do this nowadays, thankfully, because of the internet, information is at our fingertips. And I was doing some research on the topic, and I found an article at about.com that Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole wrote. So I reached out to her, and lo and behold, she was honored and felt like she would love to come on to the show. And I'm honored that she would take some time out of her busy schedule to call in and share her knowledge with all of us, all the way from across the globe, I believe in Austria. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. But Nicki, would you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself very briefly, please?
Yes, thank you, Scott. It really is a pleasure to join you and John in discussion today. I am a sociologist with training and expertise in systems of inequality in a broad sense. So I've studied race and racism quite extensively, as well as class inequality, gender inequality, and other forms of inequality that cause problems for many people around the world today. Currently I'm writing a book about the popularity and hidden costs of Apple products. And so race and economic inequality play a big role in that, and how I analyze problems within a complex global supply chain like Apple's. But I think today we're going to focus on race in the U.S., which is something I follow in the news quite a bit and care about deeply as someone who's committed to fighting for justice and equality, even though I now live in Austria. And I look forward to discussing white privilege and systemic racism with you today.
Awesome. We are truly honored to have you as our expert today to dialogue with John and I. And I really appreciate it. And again, she's calling from all the way across the globe in Austria. What time is it in Austria, Nicki?
It's 6 p.m.
6 p.m. Awesome. So there's a 6-hour difference. Okay, so
yes.
So let's get into it. I want to take some time just to thank all of our listeners for taking time out of your busy day, no matter where you are, whether you're on a lunch break or you're listening to this later in your car on your way home. I just want to say thank you, and I really appreciate you. So to start each show, I like to talk about dialogue because it's a huge part of what this show is all about. And during each show, I'm going to share a different definition or example of dialogue as defined in the book, Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together by William Isaacs. So in dialogue, one listens to understand, to make meaning, and to find common ground. To contrast that, in debate, one listens to find flaws, to spot differences, and to counter arguments. So, RaceHaven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to lead a movement towards racial harmony in America. So here's our framework for authentic dialogue on this podcast. Number one, participants will listen with a sense of curiosity and ask questions to uncover the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind someone's statements. Number two, participants are willing to communicate their thoughts openly and honestly while putting aside emotions, defensiveness, and a desire to be right. Number three, participants approach someone who sees a problem differently, not as an adversary, but as a colleague in common pursuit of better solutions. So, welcome to the dialogue. John and Nicki, are you ready?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Absolutely, sir.
All right. So in segment one, we're going to dive into white privilege. This is a term that has hit the mainstream. For myself, I would say I came into knowledge of this term probably around 2014. So it's a fairly new term to me. So what we're going to do is we're going to just spend some time dissecting this based on our own common knowledge, both John and I, and then we're going to bring in Dr. Nicki to share her professional perspective as someone who researches this from a sociological and point of view. So, John, let's start with you. What does this term mean to you, if anything, John? Because we haven't had a chance to talk about this. Do you have, just share with our listeners what you think, or what does white privilege mean to you?
I will tell you that I've heard the term a number of times, and without being officially aware of its definition, the way it's been hinted at or described is that being white allowed me opportunities that didn't exist for others simply because I came from a certain area, I looked a certain way, and I guess the easiest analogy would be traffic stops or being I guess, viewed differently when walking through a store. That they kind of termed white privilege is you get to kind of like be invisible or a ghost. People just kind of ignore you because of your color or because of your appearance. So that's kind of how it has bled into my mind from conversations I've had.
Okay. And let me ask you this, John. When you first heard of the term white privilege, how did it sit with you? Was it did you feel attacked, or did it seem offensive in any way?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I don't ever feel attacked, but the initial reaction I have is you don't know me, and to say white privilege means you don't respect what I've done or you think I've gotten some free pass in life. So it's not so much offensive, but it just makes me shake my head and say, you're better off asking me questions than assuming that because I'm Caucasian, I got some free pass. Did I have some breaks? Absolutely. But I believe that for every break I got because of being, a white Caucasian male, there's an equal obstacle that I had to overcome because of it.
Okay. So would you say that primarily when you hear white privilege, do you think about economic situations? Like, does that sit with you more? Because I've in reading things, I've seen a lot of European Americans who state that it's similar to what you just said. It's been hard for me too, and I had to go out and work just as hard as everyone else. There's no privilege. I didn't I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth, or I'm out here working for my education and for these jobs and businesses just like the next man. So they kind of have a hard time wrapping their mind around it, primarily from an economic standpoint, and especially, and you may not be able to speak from this, but especially when I've read articles that kind of spoke to the perspective from low-income European Americans and how they have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. So would you say that from an economic and job and business, and from that standpoint, is that kind of the space that you kind of think of it in?
Well, there's no doubt, and I don't know. Do I have like 2 or 3 minutes to kind of give a really great example of why that
Yes.
does have an impact for me?
Sure.
I'll be as brief as I can, but my dad, everybody knows my dad as a doctor, but what most don't know is he's the oldest of 6 children who his dad was a carpenter, and they were dirt poor. And my dad wanted to be more, but they didn't have any money. So his dad, my grandfather, told him, then start working. So at a very young age, he had a work ethic, and he actually worked to go through Catholic high school instead of public school, worked to pay his way through college, and then worked to pay his way through medical school. I was born. He then has some kids. I'm about 12 or 13 years old. He looked at me and he goes, I want you to learn something real early. Just because your dad might have a lot of money, you don't have any. He said, you didn't need to work. So at the age of 13, he had me working literally just jobs that nobody would do because I was too young to get working papers. You had to be 15 to be legally working. But I was doing odd jobs, cleaning up trash, emptying trash, just doing that kind of stuff because he instilled in me, no one's going to hand you anything. You got to work if you want to be something. And then to kind of wrap it all up, people ask me about my motivation and my work ethic. I look at it this way. I was very fortunate, and I will use the word privileged, that my dad said to me, you work hard in school, you get the grades, and I will pay for college wherever you'll be accepted. I now look at that not as that I was some silver spoon. I have that same responsibility for my son. So my work ethic is I can't allow my son now to have to go out there and struggle where I was given that gift, but I'm not going to spoil my son. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make him understand a work ethic, and he's got to work and earn his way as well. So I don't know. Does that count as privilege? I look at it as it's just, the way I was raised, but it was to have a work ethic and respect everything.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. So if I can do something right now, I'd like to share my perspective. And let me just say this, because I have had a lot of time to think about this, and I totally understand where you're coming from, John. And, I think that your father, taught a very important lesson. And people like yourself and even myself, based on some of the lessons I've learned growing up, that's such a gift, to have that type of adult modeling in our lives. So with that being said, as I encountered white privilege, as an African-American person who is socially conscious as I am, when I saw white privilege, it was like an aha moment initially, because I've always tried to explain these nuances and these differences based on the things that I can see in terms of some of the racial disparities that still exist in America. And so when I first learned of the term white privilege, I thought it was great, because it began to unpack some of the complexities and some of the nuance in race relations that are hard to articulate up until that point. Were hard for me to articulate, and what I saw and just in the mainstream and just in people having these discussions were hard to articulate. And, you know, I guess, unfortunately, you also get the flip side where some people only want to look at, one side of it. And they may not look at the complexities like what you just explained, John. And one of the things that I did as an exercise for myself as an African-American is I started to look at the different privilege that I had because, I realized that just the concept of privilege in itself, there's levels to it. And there's so much complexity. And that's why I put on this podcast, because I feel like sometimes people get on with everything that comes up in the mainstream, we want to jump to sides. And I feel like, whereas I believe that, yes, white privilege is the term and the concept is something that we needed for these type of discussions. But I also see out there in the media, mainstream, as well as social, where there'll be certain people who will jump to the side of saying, white privilege exists, and they're kind of pointing the finger. And then there's a certain side of people who only want to defend it. But there's very few people willing to examine all the layers of it and the complexities from a mid-ground. And that's what I'm, excited that we get to do today. And, as an example of that, I'll say that myself, I think about the privileges I had because, growing up, my grandfather is who I say broke the cycle, because I had this concept that every African-American who's a descendant of a slave, someone in their lineage had to break the cycle of the mental chains as well as the poverty that we came from, that our ancestors came from when they were emancipated and started from the bottom and nothing. And unfortunately, there's still people today who haven't. No one in their family lineage has broken that chain and broken that cycle. But I was fortunate because my grandfather on my dad's side broke that cycle. And he literally pretty much he was raised by his sister, had a rough upbringing, raised by his older sister, but put himself into the military and took advantage of the GI Bill after serving in World War II, took advantage of the GI Bill and went to college in his early 30s and got a degree. Late 20s, early 30s, and then went on to get a master's degree and went on to be a principal and an educator and an educational leader in the town he's from in small Apalachicola, Florida, and then went on to put all 4 of his kids through college at Florida A&M University. So my grandfather broke the cycle. And because of that, I grew up with a level of privilege. Okay, because when I was growing up, there was never a question about if I was going to attend college. It was just one of those things where, it was assumed because my grandfather had set that tone about education from that side of the family. Now, on the flip side, my family in Philadelphia came from very meager beginnings and continued to be poor, even through a lot of the family members that were siblings of my mother. And my mother was one of the people from her family to go to college. Maybe 2 to 3 out of 10 went to college. And then she and my father met. But a lot of my family members in Philly, there's still a lot of the traditional, I guess, stereotypical inner city African-American ills that have plagued that side of the family. So every summer when I had a chance to go visit my grandfather, I left Philadelphia from that environment to go visit my grandfather. He was like my biggest role model. He was that beacon. He was the person who I looked at when I saw, what my future could be. So that, in a sense, was a privilege for me. So I just wanted to share that because I understand that even as an African-American, and there's nothing out there that's called, African-American privilege, but I do recognize that there are privileges just based on the family you grew up in as well. So I want to bring in Dr. Nicki right now. And Dr. Nicki, I'd like you to share with us from your sociological, and I hope I'm saying that right, sociologist or sociological point of view, if you could share with us and our listeners, what is white privilege? Where did it come from? And why do we even need the term?
Yeah, absolutely. And you are saying it right. Wow, what an interesting dialogue the two of you just had. I have a lot of things I'd like to say in response as well, but I'm happy to start with the sort of sociological insight. The term white privilege really was popularized by Peggy McIntosh, who is a scholar in Massachusetts, and she wrote an essay back in 1988 that started to get a lot of traction in universities at that time, and has been used as a teaching tool in the social sciences and in the humanities and in even things like professional diversity training since that time. And it has had a resurgence in recent years, I would say largely due to the Black Lives Matter movement and the attention that white privilege as a piece of racism, what that has to do with the problems facing the Black community in the United States today. But what Peggy McIntosh articulated is that we can think about white privilege as an invisible knapsack that we carry around on our backs. And it's got all of these benefits, tools, maybe you might think of them as like coupons or get in free passes inside of it. And it's invisible. She uses this metaphor because for the most part, we, and I say we because I'm white, we white people are not aware of it. And this is why a lot of social scientists and racial activists think it's very important to teach this material and to speak about it like we are today, because I think awareness of it is really important. That it's a responsibility that white people have to develop an awareness of it in order to be a part of moving toward an equal and just society. So, I mean, she has an essay. If listeners are interested, or if either of you are interested, you can easily find it online by doing a web search. It's called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and you can easily find copies of it online. It's very short, easy read. And she has 50 points, 50 different items that she lists as within this invisible backpack, and they're really a wide range of things. But there are things like, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I could avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. Things like, my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. Or I can talk with my multiple and not have people put this down to my color. It goes on and on and on. But it largely comes down to what, the privilege of being white is, as John spoke to early on, being considered normal, or having your race just be not even really seen or noticed necessarily, in the way that, say, if a Black person goes shopping in a store with a white clerk, a lot of Black folks report the phenomenon of being watched or being followed around, or even being accused of shoplifting openly. This is not something that happens to white people for the most part, unless, say, we have some other form of stigma, social stigma, that might be attached to our body, say by our dress, or maybe by having a lot of tattoos or piercings, things that might signal to someone that we're not quote-unquote normal, or maybe there's a reason not to trust us. But the point is that we can go through life on a daily basis feeling fairly comfortable, feeling like people trust us or take our word, and that if we do something bad, we're not going to be expected to speak for the whole of our race or be considered a disgrace to our race. We can expect people to hear our complaints or hear our concerns when we voice them, and to respond in kind to what those are. So this is how we understand white privilege from a sociological standpoint. And I understand John's point of view about not wanting others to suggest that what you have achieved or earned is simply because of your race, especially in America, right? We have this belief in the American dream that if you just work hard enough, you can get ahead. You have to make the right kinds of choices. And you both spoke very poignantly to that effect about how that has been a part of your life and the lives of your parents and grandparents. I feel the same way. I was the first person in my entire family to go to college. So for me, college was not an obvious path. Getting a PhD was definitely not an obvious or assumed path. And I feel very proud of how hard I worked to accomplish these things. But in learning about white privilege, which is something I really started to understand in graduate school when I took courses on race, I have come to see that there are many ways in which my race has made life far more easy for me than it would have been if I was born a Black woman, or if I was born a Latina, or maybe a South Asian woman. One of those things is having access to wealth and money. Now, I don't come from what would be considered a wealthy family, but if I need money sometimes, my parents can loan it to me. They have available cash. And I think about the long legacy of racism and oppression that has followed slavery. And I think you two spoke to very different life stories and histories in that regard. John, you pointed out how your father was dirt poor and chose to work very hard to raise himself up out of that and really instilled that value in you. And as you spoke, I thought to myself, well, I wonder what era that was when his father decided to go out and get a job. And was it perhaps during segregation or when Jim Crow laws were still in effect? And if that was the case, would he have been able to do that if he were Black? And I think that's one way in which we can see white privilege playing a role in your life history. It doesn't mean that your father didn't work hard and earn what he did based on his work, but that his skin color played a role in determining whether or not that was even possible for him.
That's a very interesting point. And I struggle with John, right? As a friend of mine, you want to breach these topics, but you struggle with being offensive and hurting people's sensibilities, because let's face it, I'm going to assume I know what John's age is. So in assuming when his father was a child, absolutely, his father was probably a child during pre-civil rights, during the pre-civil rights era. And not to say that there weren't African Americans who were able to go out and maybe get a job and maybe work their way through school, but I think what white privilege tries to get people to understand is that those opportunities were few and far between. Those people, the opportunities were just more widely available for Americans of European descent. And I think that's one of the things. And because of that, now John is able to grow up in a household where his father has a higher level of education, a higher income base, where his father can put him into, pay for him to go to college, whereas there's other people in other races, and again, this is speaking from a high level in terms of the number of people who can do it, who may not have had the opportunity to do the same on the same scale. And I got to imagine that's kind of a shock to someone's sensibilities. And I can see how someone would say, hold on, don't diminish, don't diminish what we accomplished. Don't diminish what my father accomplished. Don't diminish what my grandfather accomplished. They worked hard. So, John, from your standpoint, how does one balance that? And I don't know where it sits with you right now, in understanding with Dr. Nicki is sharing, but yes, your father worked hard, but maybe he had access to a certain job or the ability to get into a certain school that may have made, or the ability to go out and get loans or financing, whatever it took to get through school that others may not have had as much of an opportunity to get to. How does that sit with you? And just how does that sit with you?
Well, I will preface my comments by saying, you know me well enough, Scott. I don't get offended, so please always, I mean it sincerely. Speak authentically and don't be concerned. We're tighter than a miscommunication, so don't ever worry about that. Even further to the point, I'm not offended by it. I actually agree and understand the concept. There have been opportunities going back, not in my generation. I'm going to be 48 this year, but in my generation, I don't feel it's really nearly as prevalent, but going back to the former generation, my dad was born in 44. So when he was getting his first job at, 10, 11, 12, you're talking about the mid-50s. I can tell you that it wasn't that he was hired, at some company. It was odd jobs. And when I say working, it was shoveling snow, it was cutting the grass, it was doing yard work, it was doing that kind of grunt work, that anybody could do if they wanted to. And to your point, again, it doesn't diminish on any level the work ethic or the fact that he wanted to have a job. I believe, honestly, what it comes down to for a lot of folks, and I see this myself, and I will probably, you guys can feel free to correct me if I say this wrong. Growing up, as I said, I was 13 years old. I'll never forget it. My dad walked out of the office, saw me laying by the pool, shook his head, walked back into the office, and the next day I had a job. He said, "You're not going to lay around the pool all summer long." And the job I got, Scott, Wildwood, New Jersey, it was cleaning up the boardwalk. His best friend owned one of the piers, and he said, "This kid's not laying around the pool all summer. Make him work." And they didn't know what to do because I was 13. They couldn't basically put me on the books. So the job was to empty all of the trash cans from the night before on the boardwalk and sweep the pier. And it was the most disgusting job in the world. And the irony of it was I got the job because they couldn't pay anybody enough to do it. Nobody that was old enough to work, white, black, Asian, didn't matter, was going to do that job. So they gave it to the kid that they could control. So I only share that because there were white kids that didn't want to do that job. There were African-American kids that were, in their 16, 17, 18 years old that needed to make money. So again, if I'm saying it, if I'm communicating it in the wrong way, please feel free to educate me on it. But I look at it, based on a merit system, meaning what are we willing to do? And I think a lot of times people have this expectation of what job they should have or what they should be able to do, and sometimes you just do what you have to do or what's available. And I see that today, as you know, Scott, I've been training in home-based business for 3 decades. And I see people that feel that they're somehow too good for or above home-based business. And I shake my head and I just think, you know what? If you need to make money, you do what you can to make money. And if you can upgrade what you're doing down the road, upgrade it. But when you need to work, it comes down to work ethic and merit. So all the way from my dad to today, I think a lot of it, I don't want to say it's a personal choice because there's sometimes the cultural differences and society will dictate, but I guess I come from a mindset of we can find a way if we work hard enough. So hopefully that came out,
absolutely,
in a pleasant way, not trying to sound defensive or anything.
Well, no, and I'll say to you the same thing you said to me. One, it didn't come out offensive, but two, we need each other's most authentic selves here in order to move this conversation forward and for our listeners to really learn and understand our perspective. So thank you for being that candid and continue to be even just as authentic and as candid as you can. I just have one more question before I let Dr. Nicki jump back in.
Sure.
So from a social standpoint, because I'm like you, right? I understand that, and I've always had that mindset. If where there's a will, there's a way. But what role do you think the social side of it plays? When you even mentioned being stopped by police officers, or the things that we see in terms of police abuse or things like that, and even walking in a store, or back to the 50s and the 60s where there was something with redlining, where there had to be laws to say that you can't you can't lock out African American people from certain neighborhoods, which was very prevalent in this country, which also stifled the growth of wealth for African Americans for decades after abolition. So what role, or do you acknowledge the role that the social, the subtleties of, I guess, white privilege, with being able to live in a certain neighborhood where the value of homes costs more, so therefore you're able to pass down that value and that wealth to generations, where African Americans were shut out from that, which leads to another area that people speak of. And then in terms of how African Americans are policed and things like that. Do you think there's any validity to that in terms of how Americans of European descent and African Americans have had to face those things? Do you think there's any privilege in that way?
I will say this. I don't know that I'll use the word privilege, but I will say economics play a major factor, and this may really open up a whole nother level to this. Scott, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I grew up in South Jersey in Voorhees, and at the time, that was the hotbed for all professional athletes in Philadelphia. So in my neighborhood where I grew up with the children of a lot of the pro athletes. So there was a lot of white and black mixed in there, but it was all very affluent. So it was a very different economic status. And it was really weird because we didn't see each other as white kids and black kids. We just played and had fun, but we didn't have that stigma that you're mentioning until I then went to other areas. And literally, again, playing with my friends, playing basketball, playing football, we would go to the mall. And they would say stuff like, we can't go in there. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We can't go in there. We're not allowed in there. And that was when I was probably, 14, 15, 16, that I was first aware of the fact that there really was two completely different social settings or standards. And I honestly don't look at that as much as race only as economic only, because when I was there doing things with the neighborhood kids versus the kids from the other neighborhoods, it just didn't seem to apply because, their dads were professional, baseball, basketball, and football players in Philadelphia. So it really was two different worlds. Both sets were African American, but one was from a very affluent and the other one was from just a regular old background.
Right. Okay. Well, and I appreciate that perspective and that answer. So, Dr. Nicki, I want to ask you, before you answer the next question, growing up and even now, do you identify with a certain political party or a certain term like conservatism or liberal? Do you identify with any of those?
I identify as a radical leftist, and I am an ardent supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders in this election. And I identify that way because of all that I've learned through my schooling and my research about how inequality functions. I understand that inequality is built into our economic system and our social system. And I, as a social scientist, understand that we need to change those systems in order to have an equal and just society. And so, I'm way out there on the left.
Okay, and just to be clear, I heard you say, did you say a radical something? How did you frame that?
Radical leftist.
Okay, a radical leftist.
I use radical in the true sense of the word, which in Latin, radix means root. And so to say that you're interested in radical change really means that you're interested in changing the roots or changing the system as it operates from the base up. And that's what I mean. Okay.
So my question to you is this. I hear a lot of conservatives say that liberals use race to keep people divided and to win votes. I've been hearing that a lot in the news cycle recently. And I want to get your thoughts on that, and also just your thoughts on the fact that there are certain people that may listen to this podcast, and because you just said that you are a leftist, they're automatically going to discount everything you said, and they're going to say, oh, it's because she's a liberal and or a leftist. And I want to understand that because I look at you as someone who's a sociologist who studies, social systems as a profession. So I put a lot of weight on you, your point of view and your perspective, because I know that it was, it was something that was gained through rigor. It wasn't just something that you picked up from listening to people talk in your neighborhood or on the news. I know that you probably even spend time looking at contrasting viewpoints that may lean more conservative. So I want to know your thoughts on the fact that there's going to be people who are going to listen to this podcast and they're automatically going to, discount what you have to say because you're a leftist. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a big problem, and it's something that equally happens on the left as regarding people on the right. I actually recently wrote an article about the 2015 or 2016 electorate for About.com, and one of the points that I made, drawing on research from the Pew Research Center, is that currently people who identify as on the left and people who identify on the right are as far apart from each other, ideologically speaking, and in terms of having real negative feelings toward the other than they have ever been in history. Over the last several decades, people who identify as Democrats and people who identify as Republicans have been increasingly shifting away from each other. And at the same time, we've seen the rise of the information society on the internet and the rise of social media. And I believe there's a troubling phenomenon attached to these, which is that when we interact with people online, we're very desensitized from their humanity, from who they actually are as a person. And it's very easy to just fixate on an idea and to consider someone stupid or ignorant or mean-spirited if we don't agree with it. And it's really easy to infer unintended meaning into comments online as well, because we're not actually dialoguing with a person like we are here in this conversation. So I think that we have some real barriers to cooperation and dialogue and really moving forward together that are big challenges for the whole of society to deal with, I think.
Wow, I totally agree with that sentiment. And again, that's just another reason why we do what we do with RaceHaven, especially on in our Facebook group, where we have conservatives and liberals and all across the spectrum on there. And you know, one of the things that I try to do, even though it does get emotional sometimes and people do get defensive, is I try to just facilitate dialogue and bring people back to understanding that at the core, at the base of it all, it's all about building relationships. And if you're able to, and I love how you said, we forget about people's humanity. And that's one of the things that I try to be mindful of when I'm reading things from a conservative perspective, is that this is a person that has real fears and real concerns. And even though I may not, totally agree with their viewpoints, I want to know why they feel the way they feel, because I feel like where we can connect is in the why. We may not necessarily connect on the policy level or on the surface level, but I think in the underlying level of the feelings behind and the beliefs behind and the reasons why, people feel the way they feel, I think that's where solutions lie. It lies in the why, in the underlying beliefs and assumptions, and being able to communicate with each other and dialogue about those and come to a mid-ground through those. And that's one of the reasons why I personally, I tell people I'm apolitical, because there's no party, and I don't even believe in parties. I believe in dialogue. I really do. I believe in dialogue and collaboration. And I think that all problems can get solved that way. And so, we'll get on to politics in another show, maybe next week. I think that's what we're going to talk about, so I won't go there. But, with that being said, we do have a caller that I want to let jump in right now. If you're listening and you want to jump in, you can call in now to share your perspective on these topics by dialing 929-477-4107, then press 1. So right now I'm going to go to a caller that we have. Let's see. The area code is 404, and the last 4 digits of the phone number is 9477. Caller, if you could say your name and tell us where you're calling in from, we'd appreciate it.
Montoya from Atlanta.
Hello, Montoya. Welcome to the dialogue.
What's going on, brother?
Doing great, man.
Hey, I don't have a lot of time. Yeah, I don't have a lot of time, and I was listening your previous comments referring to the idea of the privilege of previous generations of having access, and then I guess you're in a sense referring to white privilege. And since I don't have a lot of time, I just want to put the term white privilege in context.
I lost you, Montoya. Are you there, Montoya?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. So we the last thing I heard you say was you wanted to put the term white privilege into context. So go ahead.
Correct. Because when we had this discussion, basically, since there are two sides to this issue, I mean, and obviously that's why you're having this discussion. The biggest problem is the understanding of that term. And so anytime I hear white privilege and people start talking about work or hard work, then I know the two sides have a completely different understanding of what the term means, because you have, like myself, who believes that there is a system of white privilege in the country. Well, what happens is when I'm using the term white privilege, I'm not talking about the idea that somebody had it easy, but the response for those who disagree or don't believe is that I work hard. Or I heard in the conversation you were just having, you were asking one of your panelists about the idea of access being different for previous generations, and the response. And unfortunately, the podcast cut out, so I'm kind of being unfair. I didn't hear the end of his response, but he immediately went into these individual stories of hard work. Well, if I'm saying white privilege exists, and I'm not suggesting that someone didn't work hard. We all, whatever place in life that we have, comes from some series of work per se. But white privilege has absolutely nothing to do with how hard you work. It's not suggesting that someone that has more access works any less hard. So those individual stories always lets me know that the two sides are talking in two completely different contexts, if what I'm saying is making sense. So I'm just simply saying that if I hear the term white privilege and the conversation goes to work, then I know there's no grounds going to be made in that conversation, because the two sides are talking about a concept that they neither understand what each other is referring to.
So Montoya,
go ahead.
Let me just see if I can take you in a direction that I think will be beneficial. So when you talk about the two sides, so I want to know the other side. So when you're talking to someone and they're talking about work, what is it that you think that they should be hearing?
Okay, so for example, when we look at just, whether you look at different numbers, so look at access to college or access to job opportunities, or you see industries that are devoid of any diversity, then and you're showing those numbers to say, okay, there's been no emphasis to improve these areas, and you're saying, okay, here's a level of white privilege that may have existed historically, and that industry now has not made any grounds, sometimes by choice, sometimes it's not even been addressed. So when you're suggesting that there's a sense of white privilege in an industry and someone starts speaking about work, I'm sitting here going, I'm talking about clearly here's information that shows there's no access to this. So I don't understand. I think they should be hearing about the access problem. I don't think
Give us an industry. What industry? Give me more specific industry that you're speaking.
Okay, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't have a lot of time. I do have to go. I really do have to go. But okay. I'll just remember recently, and I'm sorry I don't know the specifics because I'm just calling and doing off the top of my head. But I remember recently, I think it may have been. I don't know if she's a CEO, but there's recently, like for example, there was a black woman at the high level, I think at Walmart or some top company, and she recently had a meeting, probably in the last month, where she met with a lot of some people, I guess, at the table, and she was kind of like, and it was all white men and her, and so she says, let's have this meeting again when we've improved this, and she received all kind of backlash. And I'm sorry that I don't have all the information. I wish I did. But I'm just saying this was a high level. Like I said, I think it may have been Walmart or some high company or whatever. But at her level, she was in her position and she was meeting with all these regional leaders or something to this effect. And she's, right. So she just kind of said, we can improve this. And she received all type of backlash. And her response was, nobody would think nothing of it, and I've heard of this happening here in Atlanta specifically at the AJC, for example. Nobody thinks nothing of it if you have a company that is a boardroom full of white males. Like, that's so normal, nobody thinks nothing of it. I'm not saying that having a boardroom of white males in itself is the problem. I'm not saying that in itself is the problem. But when we're talking about white privilege and access, I don't know what hard work has to do with it at all. But again, I'll say this and I'll have to go. That when I hear the term white privilege being debated and I start hearing work hard or I work hard, then I know the two sides are not talking about the same term. That's kind of the point that I would call to make.
Well, thank you for calling in, Montoya. We really appreciate it. You have a great day. And so what I hear the caller saying, Montoya, who's a contributor on our Facebook page, and he has a podcast of his own called the Mental Dialogue Podcast, so look that up. He brings a lot of good knowledge. But what I want to say is this. He's speaking about access. So, let's see, Dr. Nicki. So in terms of access, I hear those examples all the time, about, how at the high level, the highest level of corporations all around this country is mostly white males. Okay. And would you say that that's an example of white privilege?
In some ways, yes. I would also say it's a pretty clear example of systemic racism that if you look across society, in terms of the political structure, in terms of popular culture, right? We just had the Oscars So White campaign. Chris Rock gave a searing opening monologue about systemic racism within Hollywood. We see that this is a problem that continues to structure society such in a way that elite spaces and elite positions are much more attainable for white people than they are for anybody else. But I also want to say that I really appreciate Montoya's point about making the conversation about jobs and also sort of individualizing it with our own stories and backgrounds. I think for me, the power of sociology is to be able to look at broad patterns that really course through society. And these can tell us a lot more about what's really going on in our society than can our individual vantage points. Of course, our individual vantage points are valid as a testament to our own lives and experiences. But for example, if we look at, say, the racial wealth gap, which is a manifestation not only of white privilege, but of systemic racism, we can see numbers like in 2013, the average white family had 7 times the wealth of the average black family and 6 times the wealth of the average Latino family. And these gaps have actually grown tremendously since the 1960s. So that racial wealth gap is only increasing. Now, it would be pretty absurd for us to suggest that this is happening because people are not working hard enough, right? When we look at numbers like this and we see such a great gap and that it really courses through society, we can then see that there's something wrong within the society that is causing this to happen. And I think that this is an important point. I also think it's important in dialoguing about these concepts because if you feel that if you're a white person being confronted with the concept of white privilege, I think for a lot of us, it's easy to feel attacked or threatened because there is the implication that you haven't legitimately earned what you have in life. But the real point is that it's not about us as individuals. It's about understanding how the system operates, right? The system overall to privilege a certain group of people over others. And if we can make the conversation about that, about the problems within the system, rather than trying to place blame on individuals or pit individuals against each other, then I think we can actually make some progress. And I think some other really compelling examples of white privilege are if we think about, the problem of police killings in the United States. I've written an article about this for About.com. There's a fair amount of data available now that shows us that police are killing Black people at far greater rates than any other race. The data also shows us that most of those Black people killed are unarmed when they're killed, but that the confrontation was described by the killer as resulting from what they perceived as suspicious behavior. And this is something the suspicious behavior is really something that's just coming from the fact that this is a Black person being viewed by a white person in many cases. So we see these broad patterns, and these broad patterns are what really tell us that we've got a problem of racism and that white privilege is real. White parents don't have to have the conversation, quote unquote, with their sons about how to deal with police officers so that they won't get killed when they encounter them. And Scott, I'm sure you know what I mean when I say the conversation.
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a social systemic problem and not something that we should really internalize or think about in an individual way, but really think about how is this affecting society in a broad way, and then how might that impact our individual lives.
Well, that's a great segue into systemic racism, which is the second segment that we're going to close out with. And you touched on it a little bit. And what I like to do, because this was the genesis of me actually reaching out to you, there was, your article that you wrote on systemic racism that, I posted on Facebook in our Race Haven group. If anyone wants to read it, or if you're a friend of mine on Facebook, you'll see it there as well. And I posted that article, and I want to read a comment from one of our group members in Race Haven, whose name is Sean. And, I posted your article, and I asked people what they thought. And Sean said this. He said, as to the question, I cannot help but see systemic racism as something that's self-inflicted since legislative equality has been addressed 50 years ago. African Americans are just as much a part of America's history as anyone else. But since the land was fought for and won by mostly Europeans, those are the ideals which the nation's been founded on. And looking around the globe at the many comparative governing examples, nobody really can convince me that these ideals aren't the best. But for a variety of reasons, mostly psychological conditioning, you'll find that most of the Americans who feel disenfranchised are refusing assimilation or conformity to the core ideals of freedom and equality. So what are your thoughts about Sean's position that, systemic racism, his basic thing, and we had a long discussion about this online, and the overall premise was that it's in our minds. He said it's based on psychological conditioning, but he doesn't think it exists. And another thing that he said, in terms of, he made another point. Actually, I'll let you comment on that first, and then I'll give you his second point. So do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Nicki?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's not an uncommon viewpoint among white people and perhaps even some people of color. But because we do recognize that civil rights legislation was passed in 1964 and 1965, and these were important events that really changed the legal structure of our society as regards how rights are brokered on the basis of race. These were hard-fought pieces of legislation and were important, right, in moving towards equality in our nation. But the thing is, you can't legislate beliefs, and you can't legislate internal bias. So, years later, we still have the same kinds of racist practices and racist beliefs existing within our population and being perpetuated within our social institutions, like school and the media, politics, within the economy, by the police. These are still perpetuated because you can't legislate them. And the idea of refusing assimilation, I think that's a bit naive. I'm not sure where someone would get that idea necessarily, perhaps by not interacting with very many people of color. Most white people are very socially segregated and have very few people of color in their social networks. But I would point out, again, I would go back to social science and point out what we know to be true based on research, which is that, okay, if you want to think about the assimilationist argument, let's say that going to college is a form of assimilation to mainstream white culture for people of color. In that regard, we have data, we have research that shows us that when students start to reach out to faculty members who they would like to work with when they become graduate students, a study was conducted that found that based on racially coded names being used with email accounts and emails from mock students were sent to professors across the country, that it was white men that got responses far more often than anybody else. Somebody whose name was interpreted to be a white man, say something like Matthew Smith, versus receiving an email from Tyrone Johnson or from Hector Martinez, okay? So what that shows us is that it's not a question of assimilation or of choosing to work hard or of choosing to pursue paths that are supposed to be the pathways to success in the United States, higher education, but that there is bias that's operating within people and within these institutions, often unconscious, right? I don't think people are trying to be horrible racists, but that these biases exist. And so those are barriers, right, to access to these pathways that are supposed to lead to success.
Yeah, and in my mind, I always I came up with a term that I use in my own mind, the accidental racist. I believe that there's a lot of people that do it, like you said, it's an internal bias because of conditioning through, based on our history. And I believe that people don't do it on purpose. A lot of people don't do it on purpose, but unless you are aware and you're willing to check your biases, they will go unchecked and could cause harm. And what troubles me is when we were having this long dialogue, online, I try to be open-minded and I really try to check my bias. But I have a hard time thinking that I'm wrong because basically Sean, and the interesting thing is Sean is someone, he shared with us that he grew up in a majority African-American community. And so he was the minority growing up because he's European-American. So, and he shared these thoughts and basically his whole thing is that racism doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. So, he thinks that it's kind of in our minds because it was legislated out. But he's not acknowledging, and then we talked about bias, but he's not acknowledging that bias you just spoke of. So when I see studies like you mentioned about, that email you just said or the resume thing, when people send, there's people who have sent in a resume with their African-American sounding name and then sent in the same exact resume with a European-American sounding name and to the same employers, and they got responses, way more responses from their European-American sounding name than they did from the African-American sounding name. And there are several examples of that being done in several studies that we've seen, and yet some people still want to, say that these things don't exist. And, I find that interesting. John, I want to let you get in. And also I want to say about the financial, the wealth gap. I think the wealth gap is so telling, because at the end of the day, there's gateholders that have keys and access to opportunity, and the majority of them happen to be European American. And there's not a lot of people. Unfortunately, I understand. For someone who thinks like myself, I'm going to go out and kill what I eat regardless. John, my mindset because we're cut from the same cloth, and I know that's how you're cut as well. But I also understand that everyone is not built that way. Everyone is not wired that way to be an entrepreneur. Some people need to serve and work for others, and sometimes those opportunities aren't given. And there's people who don't see those things. So, John, what is your thoughts on, the topic of systemic racism and some of these underlying biases? Do you see them? Are you aware of them? Or is this something that you don't see?
Nope, I completely see them. I completely am aware of them. And to a degree, I even understand and agree with them. I think this is where, and I'm so glad that we get to have this dialogue because my hope is that we actually come up with a solution. And in full agreement with what you're saying, here's my caution. There are too many people in our society, and I say people, I'm not talking about race, I'm not talking about gender, I'm saying human beings, and I think you guys will both agree with me, that look for the path of least resistance. I won't say that they're lazy, I'll just say that they look for the path of least resistance. And it's not to one color, it's not to one race, it's not to one gender, it's just human nature. I think all of us on some level seek to be, lazy on whatever level we're looking for. But my point in saying this is we have to be careful when we start to blanket statement things and make a cultural decision. And I'll use this as the example, and hopefully it doesn't come out the wrong way, but, I acknowledge and recognize systemic racism and how, like you just referenced, somebody could send in a resume with a name that's clearly of an African-American descent or Muslim or whatever and be denied because of that. And that's wrong on so many levels, I couldn't agree more. Send in another one with a very vanilla name and get the call back. That person should be removed from their job. That's how bad I feel about that. That's just pure ignorance. But at the same time, there are same reverse, whatever you want to call it, situations where because of affirmative action or because of whatever we're going to call it, where a more qualified person is dismissed and I repeat, unqualified person is given a job. That's where I think there's a problem. Given everything equal, if we need to make changes, wholesale changes, to provide opportunity for everybody, I'm okay with it. If you and I are both up for a job and we are equal in our ability or slightly different, but we're both more than qualified for the job, and they say, John, you know what? We have to bump you because of this. Does it stink for me? Absolutely. Am I going to be a little upset? Sure. But I get the greater good. So I'm saying I completely understand it. But where my problem lies, Scott, and I think you'll agree with me, this has occurred, and this is part of why the Caucasian white community seems to remain ignorant at so many levels, is it's gone so far to say that, okay, you're not qualified for the job, but we're going to give it to you. That's where the defense comes in. That's where the anger and the frustration comes in. At least for me personally, I get that we have to make changes and you got to break some eggs if you're going to eat an omelet. But taking it too far is where we now perpetuate that division between these two cultures that we're trying to bridge the gap and heal. So don't bump me for someone who's not qualified for the job. Bump me if somebody deserves a shot that they weren't going to get because of the systemic racism for generations, but just don't give the job to somebody who's not qualified, because then everybody sits around and says, look, see what's happening now? And it becomes almost another negative on top of an existing negative. That's my personal feeling on it. It's been that way my whole life. It's why I chose the network marketing career, because it's pure merit. It's a purely merit-based opportunity. Right. And it was just for me, hey, now I don't have any excuses. If I fail, I fail because I didn't either understand, learn, apply, I was too lazy, whatever. And I think you'll agree with me that we both have seen in both the African-American community, I said huge Filipino communities, they thrive in this country because it's a merit-based system that race, religion, gender, culture, age, which is a discrimination in the workforce, doesn't come into play. The home-based business arena kind of became a level playing field without any parameter for somebody to be worried about.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, a discussion that's gone on plenty of times, and there's been some heated dialogues at the Race Haven Facebook group on the topic of affirmative action. And it's not something I personally have spent a lot of time researching, but what I can say is, and I'm sure Dr. Nicki may have some info on this, but from what I've heard and read and what I know, I think that the concept of someone getting hired that was not qualified is a misperception. Due to affirmative action. And I'm not even sure if affirmative action is even in play the way it was in terms of quotas, the way it was. I think that was outlawed in the 80s, based on some information I got from Montoya, that quotas in terms of I have to hire this amount of African Americans or women or Latinos have been outlawed. I think more so nowadays, it's just a culture where companies are trying to be more mindful about diversity. But what I will say, and what I think does cause division, is when I hear that and read that rhetoric online, which I see often, in that I lost out on a job for someone just because they were African American and they weren't even qualified. Because one, I just don't think that that's the case. And another thing that, someone has said is that made a lot of sense to me is how come that person who says that doesn't look to some of the the other majority European American workers and say one of them may not be as qualified as I am, and maybe one of them don't deserve to be there. And it's like, why do they only look to the handful of minorities that they're trying to use to diversify this company and point and say, I lost out on that job, or I lost my job because of them. So I think those are a couple of misperceptions, but I do understand what you're saying, John, in the sense that if that were the case, I can see how someone would be upset if they truly were losing out for someone who was not qualified. But I'll challenge that, because I think that it would not be in the best interest of a company to bring someone on for a position that they're not qualified for. there's a lot of repercussions that will come from that.
Let me just throw this in there because I want to be clear. It really is, that's the only parameter for me. It's the unqualified. But I'm going to throw another wrinkle in there because this has nothing to do with race or even gender. Nepotism has frustrated me. I've watched it happen in our industry. In my industry, I've watched it happen where nepotism, okay, so it's not a race-based, it's not even a gender-based, it's the relationship, friends, and family, where people have been given opportunities that they were not qualified for and has derailed massive success and taken companies down. So it does exist outside of racism. It does exist because of just, again, I call it ignorance. That's the term I use when people are doing things without really being educated. And people think that word is somehow negative. It's a very identifying word that, if you're going to put people into positions they're not qualified for because it's your son, your daughter, your brother, your girlfriend, your, buddy from high school or college, and they're not qualified, you're going to ruin it for everyone. So I am very clear when I say this. It's not about me looking around and going, oh, there's 8 white guys here, but, I got bumped for whatever, and whether it's African-American, Asian, female, that's never going to be acceptable to me. You can't just point the finger. It's, to me, after the fact. When you look at the people who are working and in place, you can identify the weak link, the lazy link, the unqualified link. And that's what I'm trying to say. I would have no problem saying that guy who's Caucasian does not belong there, and he's in there because he was your college fraternity brother or because he swam with you on the swim. Whatever it is, get rid of the incompetence and the unqualified in every area so that as a whole we can succeed and create something better. So that's where I wanted to just be clear on this. It's not for me race or gender. It could be Caucasian and Caucasian, but it's still an unqualified person doing a job and failing the greater good.
Sure. Okay, and Dr. Nicki, please jump in.
Absolutely. John, I really appreciate the point you just made here in your second statement about what I hear it being is about the importance of social ties. And from a sociological standpoint, we recognize that these are our most, social ties are, apart from wealth, our most important assets in society. Our connections to people, right, give us access to spaces and resources that we wouldn't have otherwise if we didn't have those connections necessarily. And I think people of color get unfairly targeted by this kind of anti-affirmative action critique when there are so many other kinds of social factors and social ties that influence whether or not people get welcomed into spaces or institutions. And I guess a couple years ago, I had a former student ask me how you might respond to someone who brings up the idea of reverse racism and the concept of affirmative action. And I found a comic that really helped me explain this. And this is using the example of college admissions, where practices of affirmative action have become highly politicized. And this comic illustrates a girl who is described as a daughter of an alum, a boy who's described as the son of a big donor, a soccer player, a woman who is described as raised in a distant state, and then there's the minority. And there's the guy who didn't get in pointing his finger at the minority saying it's his fault, but ignoring all of these other social factors that have influenced admissions for these other people. But they don't get critiqued for that necessarily in the same conversation. But that being said, it is the case that within a society that has been racist for hundreds of years since its founding, that the benefits of social ties in terms of getting ahead or attaining economic or educational success in society, those social ties have been much more available to white people than they have to people of color in mainstream institutions and spaces. And that is what we might consider a benefit of white privilege, that we have those social ties available to us. And this brings us right back to affirmative action, because this is why race-conscious policies were instituted, because we could say that white people have had affirmative action for centuries. We've had the openings to political office. We've had the openings to education. We've had the ability to work and be paid for our labor for much longer in history than have people of color. And so if we think about that, if we put it in a historical context, then the more recent attempts at affirmative action to take account of race and to help ameliorate race-based inequality, these are a tiny drop in the bucket of race-based privileges that white people have had for centuries.
So, John, do you have any follow-up questions for Dr. Nicki based on what she just shared?
No, I think she validates what I'm saying, that, you know, social ties, but I'm going to throw a wrinkle in there because it does work both ways. And again, because of my career, I've been very fortunate to be involved in, I won't say every culture, but virtually every culture. And I've witnessed it. Some people have seen it through the media and just through popular culture, but I've seen it from the financial side when athletes from, and I won't use their names, but Scott, I think you'll recognize who I'm talking about, come from, you know, very poor roots and then make it into the NBA and the NFL. And there were two cousins, and I knew them both, made it into the NFL and the NBA, but brought their entire, you know, posse with them and financed everything. They would roll into Fridays on City Line Avenue in Philadelphia. And I had friends that worked at that Fridays. They would come in there and they would take over the entire Fridays, you know, half of the bar and drop $30,000, $40,000 a night. But the reason I bring it up is financially these guys would then end up really kind of in a bad situation, almost destitute 4, 5, 6 years later because they were financing this lifestyle for 30, 40, 50 people. And so, again, it's our ties are our ties. They can either make us better or they can drag us down. And so, again, I completely understand, you know, a kid coming up from wherever makes it into the NBA. It's a scary world. You don't know anybody. You only spent 1 or 2 years in college. So who do you trust? The people you grew up with. But if those people don't have the right intentions and are not qualified, and I'm talking about giving them jobs that should have been given to people who have, you know, very qualified degrees to manage your money and things like that. Instead, it became this gigantic party, and then all of a sudden, there's no money 4 and 5 years later after earning, you know, $10, $12 million. So the ties, the nepotism, all that stuff. Yes, Scott.
Okay, so just to jump in there. So I hear what you're saying, John, and I think that with, you know, with Dr. Nicki was trying to express and Montoya and myself, and I want to know if this makes sense. I think that like these individual examples, and I think this is the hardest part for some people to understand about these terms like systemic racism and white privilege. I think the hardest thing is looking at it from a macro standpoint instead of a micro, and looking at it from a, you know, just that high level and, you know, large number standpoint and the impact. And I don't really know an answer to that. And maybe Dr. Nicki does, because, you know, when you talk about, John, the example you gave about nepotism, because nepotism was so rampant in this country for centuries, okay, before African Americans even had access to even getting jobs. And then, obviously, when they did have access, they were shut out due to things like nepotism and things like that. That was what created the need for you know, affirmative action. So when I see affirmative action, I think that's a good thing because it was needed to give you know, African Americans and other people, even and women as well, European American women who now have more positions than they did prior, and high level corporate jobs, et cetera. And what I think people have a hard time, you know, understanding is, okay, so yeah, racism and nepotism and sexism and all these things happened for centuries upon centuries in this country. And now, all of a sudden, in 2016, I have to pay for it. And then even to point to an example like the one you gave, a lot of people do that, John. And it seems like to other people, it's like, well, you're deflecting or you're not getting the overall standpoint, because we can all point to exceptions and little examples, but from a systemic standpoint, how do we get enough Americans? Okay, and here's the thing. When I say Americans, I mean all races, because I speak to African-American people who don't understand these concepts. How do we get Americans to understand that the access and the wealth and the political ties and everything compound, that everything compounds? So if you were able to have access to these things for centuries just through just the fact that you are European American or American of European descent, all that stuff adds up, and it creates opportunities that aren't available to those who didn't have that access. How do we get, and I'm asking this to Dr. Nicki, how do we get Americans to see that from a large standpoint, a macro standpoint, who have trouble, and I guess that's the best way to say it. They have trouble, and I understand how they can have trouble. They're like the people who say, why do I have to pay for something that happened decades ago, if not centuries ago?
I know you're going to go to Dr. Nicki, but please put a pin in that, because I definitely want to speak to that statement right there as far as people saying that they have to pay for something.
Okay, and really quick, Dr. Nicki, I understand. I want to let our listeners know that you have 10 minutes left, but John and I, we're going to continue because I don't want to cut it off, John, because I know you probably have more you want to say, and I don't want to stop. So, Dr. Nicki, we'll let her finish up, and then we'll let her close out. And then, John, you and I will go ahead and continue. We'll have a few more minutes. So go ahead, Dr. Nicki.
In terms of awareness of these problems, as you were saying, Scott, of the importance of seeing the macro perspective or the big picture perspective, I think education really is key. And I operate as a public sociologist, and what that means for me, it means a variety of things to different people, but what it means to me is that I want to focus my career on sharing social science insights with a broad audience, with a public audience in an accessible way. So I don't focus on writing research or academic articles for journals, but I focus on writing in popular outlets, and I'm always happy to have conversations like this one that you invited me to participate in today. So I think on one hand, there's a problem where that a lot of this research that I've relied on in this conversation, it's being produced in very exclusive spaces, and it's not available to people. For starters, a lot of it has to be paid for, and it's really expensive to access the journals if you're not currently at a university, which is how they tend to have access. And then, so there's a cost barrier. And then on the other hand, there's a linguistic barrier, because oftentimes the way these kinds of research or insights about them is written is with a very academic language that's difficult for someone who hasn't a PhD in that particular field to understand. And I don't mean to put down anyone in that regard. I oftentimes have trouble understanding research articles written by some of my peers because the language is so far from how we speak in an everyday way. And so I think, academics and researchers have an important responsibility to make findings that are relevant to society and that have important policy implications, to make them accessible, to present them in a way such that the average person can understand them, and to share them in outlets that are easily accessed. And also to really do the work of connecting results to policy to help move our nation in a more just direction. But I would also say that I think that there's room for sociology further down the educational chain, that I think it's important for a social science standpoint to be a part of the high school experience. That, you shouldn't have to wait till you're an adult to begin to understand the way inequality is built into the social system of the United States. And I'll point to one example, and that's the rise of ethnic studies programs. I think this is one way in which we see this kind of research feeding down into the lower parts of the educational structure. Ethnic studies have taken off in recent years in some cities, in middle schools and high schools. And this has been a way for students to learn about issues of race, ethnicity, how history has been constructed to teach us about white people and white people's successes, and to give us a biased view on the way racism has existed for hundreds of years and the impacts of that. There was a study recently done by researchers in San Francisco, and what they found is that at-risk students of color in urban areas who participate in ethnic studies programs have then start having higher grades, better school attendance, and a stronger sense of self, and get on the college track, where without an ethnic studies program or before it, they were not destined for college and were maybe even on the school to prison pipeline. So it shows how important a different kind of educational focus can be within that high school setting, not just for students of color, but I think also for white students. If they were to learn about these concepts at a younger age, when we're more open-minded and less politically ideological, it might be the case that people are more open to learning about these things and wanting to see solutions rather than problems.
Awesome. And I just want your perspective. To what John just said, do you have any thoughts on what John said? I want to make sure I'm understanding. I believe John is saying he understands. You're saying you understand, John. And I'm going to let Dr. Nicki go, but I want to see if she has any points to what you have to say before you jump back in, John. But I want to know if she has any points, because I'm actually getting a few texts, and, some people are taking the examples that John's giving as like, let me see, that reverse discrimination or the athlete examples don't have anything to do with, the affirmative action and the reasons why they were needed. Where I think, John, and you can correct me later, but actually no. Let me just ask Dr. Nicki. Do you have any thoughts based on what John's comments about those things?
Well, I thought John was just making a further point about nepotism, which was one of those kind of social factors that I also flagged that influence how people get access to spaces. So I understood his point. Okay. I do think that it's not necessarily central to understanding how systemic racism works.
Okay, great. Well, I want to say thank you for joining us, and And John, and I want to do this. I want to let Dr. Nicki go, and then I'm going to let you finish up,
Sure.
And we're going to close up shortly after. But I want to say thank you for joining us, Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole, for all of our listeners out there, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and share with us. And I hope maybe sometime down the line you'll come back and join us again. If you don't mind just telling our guests, how they can contact you, and anything else that you'd like to promote, and how they can find you online, or any articles or books or anything you want to share, please take a moment to do that.
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation, Scott. And John, thank you also for the opportunity to dialogue with you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think this is meaningful and important work that you're both engaging in. Listeners are more than welcome to contact me at nikkilcole@gmail.com. That's nikkilcole@gmail.com. And they can find my writing about race is primarily on sociology.about.com, which is the sociology educational site for about.com. I've written extensively about issues of race and racism, and you can find a lot of material on these topics on the site, as well as other interesting sociological findings and topics. And I'd be happy to hear from any listeners. You can also follow me on Twitter at Nicki Lisa Cole, and you can find me on Facebook, Nicki Lisa Cole Ph.D. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and you have a good evening, and we'll be talking soon in the near future. Thank you.
It was a pleasure
Great,
meeting you. Thanks so much as well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. John Costino, you still with me, sir?
I certainly am.
Awesome. Okay, so I know you wanted to jump back in before we close out, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump back in. So go for it.
Absolutely. And to clear up any miscommunication on my part that people are not realizing what I'm saying, the message I made was not dealing with affirmative action. It was dealing with nepotism, and I was trying to give another example of nepotism doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't work for white privilege, where I have experienced it, where white people who own companies gave jobs to family and friends that were not qualified to have those jobs. It didn't work there. It was very, very destructive. I simply was giving an example from the African American community and the world of sports that I happened to witness on two levels personally, that it didn't work for them either. So all I'm saying is nepotism is not healthy for anyone. It's when you bring unqualified people into jobs that you need qualified people, it ends badly for everyone. That was my whole point. It had nothing to do with affirmative action or racism or anything. It just was put qualified people into the right positions if you want to be successful in life. Now, the point that I wanted to bring back up was you're absolutely right. There's no way, and again, I'm going to be 48, so I don't have the right at my age to say that's not my fault. I shouldn't have to pay for things that happened 50 years before, 100 years, whatever. It happened. We have to acknowledge that those things happened. We have to be aware. We have to make sure they don't repeat. My whole hope and the whole reason why I will be willing to come on here anytime you ask is I believe that we as a society have to acknowledge that things happened and have to move in the direction to improve them. So it's ignorant for anybody to say it's not my fault, I shouldn't have to pay for it. But it's, in my mind, equally ignorant to sit back and say, it happened, you have to fix it on your own. And I'll point to an example of this. I think that in our country, again, as a society, we've become very helpless and very lazy. And again, I'm speaking from an economic standpoint because, my career is all about home-based business and helping people get out of financial struggles. And I have had people, I'll even use Caucasian white people in their 40s and their 50s, say to me, this looks good, but is this going to affect my unemployment? And I used to look at them and say, that's the whole point. Yes, we want it to affect your unemployment. We want you to make money and get off of government assistance. And they would actually start to think, do I want to do that? Because they've gotten so comfortable that they now think money comes from the post office. And that's not a race or a gender issue. That's a human nature issue. And I think that's my biggest frustration, that until we as a society say, yes, we have to come up with solutions, we have to find a way to improve things, we all have to pull together. So all of our decisions have to be based on that. And unfortunately, a lot of times, and most people, just flop all the way from one side to the other. And I blame the media. I blame what's going on with the politics. I mean, this is a miserable year because they're going to divide us between Democrat and Republican. And sadly, Chris Rock says it best. Use your head. Think for yourself. Most people don't even know. I mean, if you watch the videos, people don't even know how to answer basic questions, but they're going to go vote. And they're going to go vote because their entire family throughout history was Republican or was Democrat, and they don't even know what the issues are. They have no idea. But they're going to go vote, red or blue, because that's all. And I want to say to people, you should not be allowed to vote if you don't even know what the issues are. But it's just one really glaring point that says our society is hurting because of lack of awareness, lack of education, lack of caring. And it's not a white-black thing. It's not a male-female thing. It's a human nature thing. And that's what hopefully, I know this is what you're doing, and hopefully I can contribute on some level to getting people to stop reacting and thinking with a pack mentality in the masses and start thinking for themselves, because that's how we're going to get out of this.
Absolutely. And I think that people need to, hear individuals like yourself, someone who, is the CEO of a company and who's been a high-level president of several companies and part owner in several multi-million-dollar companies, in which that is your background. For those who don't know, who are listening, who's willing to breach this topic, which is, you'll find a lot of people who have, roles or titles like John that won't do that for the fear that it may turn some people off. But so I admire the fact that you're willing to do that. And I think that, you spoke to solutions, which is our final segment, which is the solution segment. And everything you just said, spoke to what the solution is. And I definitely understand what you're saying in terms of, getting away from just the polarization and the sides and everything like that. And, when it comes to systemic racism, one of the things that's important that I heard from you today is that you were willing to acknowledge that it exists. And for me, I'll say that that's a problem that I have with some other people, because you jump to the economics of it, because we all know at the end of the day, it all boils down to economics. But before you jump to the economics, you acknowledged that there is a problem. And for me personally, just speaking for myself, that's an issue that I have with a lot of people that I dialogue with online, or articles I read, or news, things that I watch. They refuse to acknowledge that there's even a problem. There's even a problem that exists. And for me, that's what I see that breeds a lot of resentment in the African American community from some people, is that when other people try to make us feel like we're crazy. And the other thing that I find interesting is that when people try to make it seem like people like Scott Speed, who say that, yes, things like white privilege exist, and things like systemic racism exist, and some Americans of European descent don't see it, and some aren't willing to acknowledge it. However, by me saying that doesn't mean that I'm lazy. It doesn't mean that I'm a victim, because I hear that a lot when people start having these conversations. That's a victim's mentality. It's all in your head. Just speaking for myself personally, and a lot of other people I know that speak this way and that, are sensitive to these issues, I'm one of the most ambitious people, that you'll ever meet. For anyone who's listening to this, who does not know me, in terms of my resume and the things I've done and the things that I continue to do. So I'm able to do both, okay? I'm able to be socially conscious and aware, as well as millions of other people in America, no matter their race. They're able to be socially conscious and aware and still chase after the American dream, and still chase after, business ownership and financial freedom, and still give back, start charities, and help others. So within this country, when I'm speaking to solutions in this segment, I just want to say that people have to open their minds to the complexities of these kind of discussions and stop thinking that it is black or white. And I'm not saying that, well, let me say it like this. Yes, in terms of race and in terms of different sides of an issue, because it's all gray. And that's the symbolism behind the logo of RaceHaven. Everyone who's listening to this, you'll notice that the logo is half black and half white, but the words RaceHaven, they're gray, okay? Because we're really, everything that we're talking about, the solution is in the gray. The solution is being willing to roll up your sleeves and diving into the gray, okay? And by diving into the gray, doing the research, opening your mind to read, listen to, and understand diverse perspectives so that we can work towards common solutions that both John and I advocated for today, as well as the things that Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole advocated for today. So that's our time for today. I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to say thank you to our caller who called in, and I want to say thank you to my guest host, Mr. John Costino, and also thank you to our special guest, Dr. Nicki Lisa Cole, where you can find her articles on about.com and just go to the sociology section. So again, John, it was a pleasure once again, my friend. I appreciate you for coming on. Please take a moment just to share with our listeners how they can contact you and if there's anything that you'd like to promote at this time.
Well, again, it's my pleasure, Scott. I love the fact that, you've taken this role and put this forward, and that's why, again, my invitation is always there. If there's anything I can do to join us, even if it's just to create awareness, because we'll promote this again on my Facebook page and get a whole bunch of people that didn't listen live to listen to the recording. Honestly, the easiest way to communicate with me is on Facebook. My private email is johncostino@yahoo.com, but I have a very public Facebook page. As Scott has mentioned and as I've referenced a few times, I love this concept because it's a platform that's going to solve problems, whether we get them done, in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, next couple of years. It's an open dialogue between two people that have much in common. I was smiling listening to you just talk, Scott, because that's exactly how I feel, that we can be ambitious, we can go work hard, but we can be socially aware and socially sensitive, meaning that's my whole purpose right now, is to try to understand as much as I can when I'm listening to your show, whether I'm on here live or just listening, because I need to understand in order for me to really be able to come up with solutions and to coexist. I need to understand how you and others feel, because it's the same way with my company. I didn't bring in partners that are going to say yes to me. I challenge them. I say, you know what? Your job is to challenge me and be challenged by me so that we can both become the very best possible and have success. If you're around people that think like you, you don't grow. If you're around people that just say yes to you, you don't grow. And I love that about you, Scott, because you've got a tremendous work ethic, you've got a tremendous mind, and the courage that you had to create this is just, it's admirable. So
thank you.
All I can say is thank you for having me on here, and please feel free to use me and my platform to get the word out at any time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you so much. Well, that's our show for today. Be sure to join us next Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Time for another exciting dialogue. Visit blogtalkradio.com/RaceHaven to listen to the podcast of previous episodes, and join us online at the RaceHaven Facebook group. If today's episode resonated with you, please share the podcast link on social media and with your friends. RaceHaven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to lead a movement towards racial harmony in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Episode 6 of RaceHaven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app, which is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks because you both are so busy? Do you neglect calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then 5 for Friends is the solution. 5 for Friends is a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends 5 minutes at a time. Simply invite all of your family and friends to download the app, and whenever you feel like talking, instead of playing phone tag, speaking to voicemail, or getting caught on the phone for too long, for a phone call that could last too long, you simply open the app, tap a button that says, I got 5, and a notification goes out to your family and friends, and you can connect with whoever calls you for a free 5-minute call from anywhere in the world. Visit the number 5 for FORFriends.com. That's the number 5 FOR Friends, 54friends.com, or your app store to download and try it today. Peace.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.